I have been asked to describe the submersibles I saw in my dream regressions. It's a rather big subject, so I'm going to have to simplify it. So I won't be describing any of the early basic kinds of submersibles, nor will I be describing the flying machines that eventually evolved into being capable of travelling underwater. I will cover flying machines in a different episode, though. So for this episode, I'm going to describe the fully developed and very commonly used ones. Submersibles were of varying sizes, with the larger ones capable of carrying large numbers of people, and the most common were just a regular form of transportation, and there were people who loved the role of piloting them. Not that they necessarily needed to be piloted that much, but yeah, it was a role that was considered admirable. So if you wanted to go somewhere using a submersible, you just asked, and someone would turn up and take you where you wanted to go. I speak about air and sea machines, but not road vehicles like we have today, because there were no such thing as road vehicles. Road vehicles required roads, obviously, and although they would have been maybe okay in a city, it wasn't really considered a feasible use of resources, as well as it being considered rather dangerous. Essentially, roads and road transportation was totally unnecessary. Of course, there were wheeled items like trolleys and even non-wheeled land-based vehicles, but they were essentially just cut-down flying machines that glided or even hovered above the ground, or in fact water. But as I said, I'm going to focus on pure submersibles. They were common throughout all the eras of Tantal, but the best and most advanced ones were from the first era, the era of Uran. By the end of the era of Japay, which was the last era, there were two types of submersible. The really old ones, from the era of Uran, that just kept going and going, and the new ones, which didn't seem to last very long and they were unreliable. These very old ones were usually made from a gold alloy, and they didn't deteriorate, nor did they rust, nor discolor. But although they were made from a gold alloy, the colour, they were actually silvery in colour. But after Uran, the people who were building these things afterwards, they never managed to reproduce exactly the alloy of the submersibles of Uran's era. So they tended to be made of other alloys, which were never quite as good. The large flying machines were also made from something unique, but I'm not sure if it was an alloy or something else. It was black, but it could also be clear, or it was clear and it could also be black. Yeah, it was like a cross between glass and metal. But I deviate again, and I will discuss that in the episode on flying machines. Inside the submersibles, it kind of changed with trends. So if there was a different preference or changing needs, but the outside of the submersible always had the look of an aquatic creature, like a fish or a dolphin or a whale. And that part of the styling never changed. The option for underwater travel was common within a city, between islands and through canals, but it could also be used for access to distant locations, but only if waterways permitted. Most of the time a person would walk places that were local, or they'd use a personal flying device, or they'd catch a submersible. The larger flying machines were the way of getting somewhere outside of the main centre, so mainly between the various cities. Even though submersibles were not often used for ocean voyages, there were some exceptions. For example, for study or if a group needed a base outside a Tantal city, where they would be able to be outside of the vision of the more primitive humans. It was always preferred that submersibles be used around locations where primitive humans were, if we needed to be in the area, because the machines were not so obvious as flying machines. The waterways of Tantal were a series of circles within circles. So it was an island, a circular island with islands around it in a circle. The waterway shape itself resembled a large wheel, and the canals that joined up these waterways went underground, so there were no gaps in the rings. An artist's impression, well, many artists' impressions that I've seen of Atlantis, which I think could be Tantal, often show a break between islands so that boats could maneuver around to get to the inner canals. But that's more like places like Carthage, but that's not the case for Tantal. Any throughway between the island canals was underground for the submersibles. In Tantal, there were hills to one side, and water would come down from these. The canals were always full, whether it was the wet season or the dry season, and that's due to the locks. But if the streams of water coming in from the surrounds was heavy, there were obviously mechanisms in place to prevent the canals from overfilling. Other than travelling around the island and the nearby plains, by the way, they also had canals, the main canal leaving Tantal, i.e. the outgoing canal, went southwest. Then it went underground before it joined up with a river which wound westwards towards a very large ocean, the Atlantic, I think. One part of the canal had a major lock that went underground, and the reason for this is because in order to be able to go and return freely, a lock mechanism was required because it was a fairly major change in elevation, and it wouldn't have been possible using normal waterways. Maybe I should explain the meaning of a lock from my perspective, because it isn't quite the same as today. So imagine a sealed underground tunnel with control sections for entry and exit, all full of water, which cannot drain out, but which goes for quite a distance, allowing a gentle gradient. This enables movement between elevated levels. By that I mean that the elevation that Tantal sat at was a lot higher than the water level of the ocean. At this point, I think I might deviate briefly, because I should note that I'm working on 2 books, and both of those books are partially set on a submersible. One book is called A Day in the Life of a Mesopotamian God, and the other is more like a novel, which is aimed to help people get a feel for what it was like living in Tantal. And it's set during the fall of the era of Bela and the start of the era of Japay. And it's planned that it will be the first of a series of prior world books. The first book I mentioned, A Day in the Life, is really my story, and I cover my life as me, Lizzie Karen, and my life as Mirren. And there are times in the story where I describe being in one of these submersibles. But I will stop deviating now on that subject, and I will get back to the topic of submersibles. So what else can I tell you? Well, I've told you what they look like and what they're made of, but I haven't mentioned much about the inside and how they were piloted. They were all very comfortable, nice seating, nice decor, even as styles changed. Oxygen came in easily, which was extracted from the water and converted into being breathable. Most of the features were automated, but the pilot maintained communications, ensured everything was operating correctly, addressed any dangers, if they arose, obviously. For example, maybe a large pod of whales or an unexpected underwater disturbance. But there were no controls like we have today to operate such machinery. No steering wheel, no buttons to push, no gears to operate. Only a screen to see what was going on outside and to show any notifications. All operations were done by the pilot, seemingly by just waving their hands in the air. But to someone of our day, it would look a little ridiculous. But the wristbands of the pilot were directly linked to the vessel, and so specific gestures would essentially be a directive to the vessel. Although there was a seat that the pilot was for the pilot could in fact sit anywhere to do their job, and they could even wander around while doing it. And it was considered very fun and an extremely social role. So what else do I need to mention? Oh, entry and exit. The vehicle was obviously sealed, so the pilot had to unseal the doors for entry and exit. I really don't know specifically how propulsion worked, but I do know it was vibrational technology. Here's an example of a regression involving a submersible. I think that pretty much covers it. It very basic kind of simplicity about pretty much all the equipment. It was intuitive, and I can't really think of anything else to tell you about it. But I will do another episode, describing an occasion from one of the dream regressions when I spent a bit of time in one of these submersibles. But for now, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.